Chapter 3 of the Blackwood Archives. His uncle served breakfast, but Thomas had already eaten, in a room that no longer existed. The eggs were cold on the plate before him, yellowed like old teeth, while Uncle Harold hummed tunelessly at the stove. But Thomas could still taste the warm porridge from the asylum's dining hall, could still feel the metal spoon between his fingers, the way it had scraped against the chipped bowl. He could remember the other patients watching him eat, their hollow eyes tracking each movement of his hand to his mouth. "Eat up, lad," Harold said without turning around. "Long day ahead." Thomas stared at the eggs. When had he gone to the asylum? The gates were chained shut, had been for years, according to Harold. Weeds grew through the iron bars and rust flaked off like dried blood. But he could remember the taste of institutional porridge, the way it caught in his throat, the sound of breathing that wasn't quite human echoing through the cavernous room. "I'm not hungry," Thomas said. Harold turned then, his watery blue eyes focusing on Thomas with sudden sharpness. "Course you are. Growing boy needs his breakfast." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, you haven't eaten since yesterday." But Thomas had eaten. He knew he had. In the asylum's dining hall, with the other patients. The memory sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy and undeniable. He could still taste the salt, the way it had been too much salt. Always too much salt in everything they served there. "When did I go to the asylum?" Thomas asked. Harold's face went very still. The humming stopped. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cottage's windows, but inside the kitchen, the air seemed to thicken. "What asylum, lad?" "Fogmoor, up the hill." "There's no asylum up the hill." Harold's voice was careful, measured. "Just ruins. Has been for years." Thomas looked out the kitchen window. Through the grimy glass, he could see the hulking silhouette of Fogmoor Asylum perched on the hillside like a great wounded beast. Its windows were dark, yes, but not empty. Never empty. Even now, he could see movement behind the glass, shapes that didn't quite resolve into human forms. "Then why can I hear the bells?" Harold followed his gaze, and for just a moment his composure cracked. His hand trembled as he reached for the tea kettle, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There are no bells, Thomas. The bell tower's been silent for 15 years." But even as he said it, the deep bronze voice of the asylum's bell began to toll, slow and mournful, counting out the hours. Thomas counted along. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. "Stop that," Harold snapped. Thomas realized he'd been counting aloud. "Stop what?" "The counting. You're always counting." But Thomas hadn't been aware he was counting. The numbers had simply fallen from his lips, like water, natural as breathing. He touched his throat, feeling the vibration of words he didn't remember speaking. Harold was staring at him now, and there was something in that stare that made Thomas's skin crawl. Not fear exactly, but recognition, as if Harold was seeing something in Thomas that he'd seen before. "What happened here?" Thomas asked. "At the asylum? What really happened?" Harold turned back to the stove, his shoulders rigid. Nothing happened. It was just a hospital, for people who were unwell. Then it closed. That's all. "But why do I remember—" "You don't remember anything," Harold cut him off. "You've never been inside that place. Never." The finality in his voice should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. It was the tone of someone trying to convince himself as much as Thomas. And underneath it, Thomas heard something else, desperation. After breakfast, which Thomas barely touched, he wandered through the cottage while Harold disappeared into his study. The house felt different in daylight, smaller somehow, as if the walls had crept inward during the night. Every room seemed to echo with sounds that weren't quite there. Footsteps on the floor above when Thomas was on the ground floor, whispered conversations behind closed doors that turned out to be empty rooms. He found himself drawn to the basement door. It stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Harold had told him the cellar was off limits, just storage, he'd said, nothing of interest down there. But Thomas could feel something pulling at him, a gentle but insistent tug in his chest, as if something down there was calling his name. He pushed the door open. The stairs creaked under his feet as he descended, each step echoing in the musty darkness below. The air grew colder as he went down, and with it came a smell he couldn't quite place, something clinical and sharp, like disinfectant, but underneath it something else, something organic and wrong. At the bottom of the stairs he found a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. He pulled the chain, and weak yellow light flooded the small space. The cellar was mostly empty, just a few dusty boxes and an old coal furnace squatting in the corner like a metal toad. But against the far wall, draped in a heavy curtain, stood something tall and rectangular. Thomas approached it slowly. The curtain was thick velvet, deep burgundy that had faded to the color of dried blood. As he got closer, he could see that it was covering a mirror, an old standing mirror in an ornate frame. He reached for the curtain, then stopped. Something about the mirror felt wrong, even covered as it was. The air around it seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the temperature were different there, warmer or cooler. He couldn't tell which. But as he stood there, hesitating, the curtain began to sway. There was no wind in the cellar, no draft from the stairs, but the heavy fabric moved back and forth in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. And with each sway, Thomas caught glimpses of the mirror beneath, flashes of silver glass that seemed to reflect something other than the dim cellar. He saw movement in those glimpses, shapes that looked almost human, but not quite. And in the center of it all, a figure in white, standing perfectly still, watching. Thomas stumbled backward, knocking over a box. The crash echoed through the cellar like a gunshot, and suddenly the curtain was still again, hanging motionless as if it had never moved at all. "Thomas?" Harold's voice drifted down from upstairs, sharp with concern. "I'm fine," Thomas called back, his voice shaking slightly. "Just looking around. Come back up here, now." There was something in Harold's tone that brooked no argument. Thomas took one last look at the covered mirror, then hurried back up the stairs. Harold was waiting at the top, his face pale and drawn. "I told you the cellar was off limits. I'm sorry, What did you see down there?" The question was so sharp, so desperate, that Thomas hesitated. Harold's eyes were wide, searching Thomas's face for something, and underneath the desperation, Thomas saw fear. "Nothing," Thomas lied. "Just boxes and the old furnace." Harold studied his face for a long moment, then seemed to relax slightly. Good. There's nothing down there for you, lad. Just old junk." He closed the cellar door firmly and turned the key in the lock. Best to stay out of there. Dangerous, old stairs like that. But as Harold pocketed the key, Thomas noticed something else. The older man's hands were shaking, and there were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. That afternoon, Thomas sat by his bedroom window, staring up at the asylum. In daylight, it looked more ruined than menacing. Broken windows, ivy crawling up the walls, sections of roof that had collapsed inward. But he could still hear the bells, faint but persistent, marking time that didn't seem to correspond to any clock he'd ever known. He tried to read, but the words swam on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense but not quite. Every time he thought he'd grasped a sentence, it would slip away, leaving him with nothing but the vague impression of meaning, like trying to remember a dream. Finally, he gave up and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked in places, forming shapes that looked almost like letters, almost like words. He found himself trying to read them, following the lines with his eyes, but they never quite resolved into anything coherent. He must have dozed, because the next thing he knew, it was dark outside. The asylum's silhouette was barely visible against the night sky, just a darker patch of darkness. But its windows glowed with a faint sickly light, as if something inside was burning with cold fire. And the bells were ringing again. Thomas sat up, listening. The sound was clearer now, more distinct. Not just the deep bronze voice of the main bell, but others too. Smaller bells, higher pitched, creating a complex melody that seemed to pull at something deep in his chest. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like the sound of grief given voice. He got up and went to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. The asylum looked different at night, more complete somehow. Windows that had been broken in daylight now showed intact glass, glowing with that strange inner light. The roof looked whole, unbroken by time and weather, and in the central tower, silhouetted against the light, Thomas could see a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a hospital gown that fluttered in a wind Thomas couldn't feel. The figure stood perfectly still, but even from this distance, Thomas could sense that it was watching him. He raised his hand and pressed it against the window. The figure in the tower raised its hand as well. Thomas's breath fogged the glass, and when it cleared, the figure was gone, but the bells continued to ring, their voices weaving together into something that was almost like a song, almost like a lullament. He turned away from the window and froze. There was a piece of paper on his pillow. Thomas approached the bed slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and covered in handwriting. His handwriting. With trembling fingers, he picked it up and read, Day 847. The treatments continue. Dr. Aldrich says I'm making progress, but I know better. I can feel myself dissolving, piece by piece, memory by memory. Soon, there will be nothing left but the name, and even that is fading. And they call me Thomas now, but that's not right. That's not who I am, who I was. The name slides around in my head like water, never settling, never sticking. And then the sleepless one comes to me in dreams. He shows me things, other places, other times. He says we are connected, he and I, two parts of something larger, something broken. And I remember a school by the moors and another by the sea, but I was never at those places, was I? The memories feel real, but they belong to someone else, someone who shares my face but not my name. The Dr. Aldrich says it's the treatment working, that the false memories will fade. But what if they're not false? What if I'm the false one? And a mirror in the basement shows me things. It shows me who I really am, but Harold covers it with that curtain, as if hiding it will make the truth disappear. And I was never born. I was remembered. The paper slipped from Thomas's nerveless fingers and fluttered to the floor. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't control them. The handwriting was definitely his. He recognized every loop and curve, the way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. But he had no memory of writing these words. Day 847, as if he'd been keeping a journal for over 2 years. But he'd only been here for 3 days, hadn't he? Thomas tried to remember arriving at Harold's cottage, but the memory was strangely vague. He could remember the long train ride, the way the countryside had gradually given way to moors and hills. He could remember Harold meeting him at the station, the awkward embrace, the drive up the winding road to the cottage. But when had that been? Yesterday? A week ago? The days seemed to blur together, running into each other like watercolors in the rain. He picked up the paper again, reading it more carefully this time, and a sleepless one comes to me in dreams. But Thomas had never heard of the sleepless one, had he? The name felt familiar in his mouth, like a half-remembered song. And as he thought about it, images began to surface in his mind. A tall figure in white, standing at the foot of his bed, empty eye sockets that somehow still managed to convey infinite sadness. A voice like whined through broken glass, speaking words in a language that predated English, but that Thomas somehow understood. When we are not one, not yet. Thomas gasped, the paper falling from his hands again. He could hear the voice now, echoing in his memory, but when had he heard it? In dreams? In waking life? The boundary seemed increasingly meaningless. A sound from downstairs made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the cottage. But Harold had gone to bed hours ago. Thomas could hear him snoring through the thin walls. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs, then began to climb. Thomas looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the small bedroom offered no refuge. The footsteps were getting closer now, accompanied by a sound like fabric rustling, like a hospital gown dragging across the floor. The footsteps stopped outside his door. The handle turned slowly, and the door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire cottage. But there was no one there. just the dark hallway beyond, and the sound of wind moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. But the smell was wrong. It was the same clinical odor he'd noticed in the cellar, sharp and chemical, but now it was stronger, mixed with something else, something that smelled like fear and madness and long, sleepless nights. Thomas. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. It was the voice from his memory, the voice of the sleepless one. That is not your name. Thomas pressed himself against the far wall, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it would burst. What do you want? To remember, to be remembered. We are the same, you and I, two fragments of something that was once whole. A figure began to materialize in the doorway, tall and gaunt, dressed in a hospital gown that had once been white, but was now stained with things Thomas didn't want to identify. Its face was human in shape but wrong in every detail, as if someone had tried to sculpt a person from memory but had gotten the proportions slightly off. But its eyes were familiar. They were Thomas's own eyes, staring back at him from a face that was almost but not quite his own. You know me, the sleepless one said, and its voice was like the echo of Thomas's own voice, heard from the bottom of a deep well. You have always known me. I don't, Thomas whispered, but even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. The figure before him was like looking in a funhouse mirror, distorted but undeniably familiar. They tried to separate us, the sleepless one continued, taking a step into the room. The doctors, the treatments, the chemicals that burned through our thoughts like acid. They thought they could divide what was indivisible, break what was already broken. More memories were surfacing now, rising like bubbles from the depths of Thomas's mind. White rooms and restraints, needles and electric shocks, doctors with kind faces and cruel hands, telling him that the voices in his head weren't real, that the memories that felt more true than truth itself were just delusions. But you escaped, the sleepless one said, and now it was close enough that Thomas could see the network of scars across its scalp, the places where electrodes had been attached. You found a way out, into the boy, into the dream of being normal. I'm not you, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, the sleepless one agreed. You are me, the me that got away, the me that found a life to steal, a name to wear like a stolen coat. The figure reached out with one pale hand, and Thomas could see that its fingernails were bitten down to the quick, exactly like his own. But I have been waiting, calling to you through the years, through the schools and the voices and the things that knew your real name, even when you had forgotten it. My name is Thomas Blackwood. No, the sleepless one smiled, and it was the saddest thing Thomas had ever seen. That is the name of the boy whose life you took, the boy who died in the asylum, who became you when you couldn't bear to be yourself anymore. The room began to spin around Thomas, reality tilting on its axis. Images flashed through his mind, a small boy with dark hair and quiet eyes lying still in a hospital bed, doctors shaking their heads, a death certificate signed and filed away, and then something else, something dark and desperate, clinging to the edges of that death, refusing to let go, sliding into the empty space left behind, wearing the dead boy's face like a mask. We are not one, the sleepless one said, echoing words from Thomas's recovered memory. Not yet. It reached out again, and this time Thomas didn't pull away. The moment their fingers touched, the world exploded into fragments of memory and madness. He was in the asylum again, but not as a visitor, as a patient. The walls were white and sterile, and the air reeked of disinfectant and despair. He was strapped to a bed, electrodes attached to his skull, while doctors watched from behind glass and took notes on clipboards. Patient shows signs of severe dissociative disorder, one of them was saying. Complete rejection of his original identity. He insists his name is Thomas Blackwood, claims memories of a life that belongs to a deceased patient. The electricity flowed through him, and he screamed, but the scream came out in two voices, his own and something else, something that had been hiding behind his thoughts for so long he'd forgotten it was there. We'll continue the treatments, another doctor said. Eventually, we'll burn out the false personality. What's left? Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But they were wrong. They couldn't burn it out because it wasn't false. It was real as anything he'd ever known, more real than the thing they wanted him to be, the thing that had been born in this place and had never known anything but white walls and the taste of medication. He fought them. Through the treatments and the drugs and the endless sessions where they tried to convince him that his memories were delusions, he held on to Thomas Blackwood like a lifeline, refusing to let go even when it felt like his mind was being torn apart. And then, one night, he found a way out. The memory was fuzzy, confused by drugs and trauma, but he could remember the feeling of slipping away from himself, of becoming something, smaller and quieter, something that could hide in the corners of his own mind while the doctors worked on the empty shell he left behind. He remembered the mirror in the basement of the cottage, not Harold's basement, but the asylum's basement, where they kept the things they didn't want the other patients to see. He'd found it during one of his wanderings, when the drugs made him forget which doors were locked and which weren't. The mirror had shown him things, other places, other lives. A boy named Thomas Blackwood who had died alone in a hospital bed, unmourned and unremembered. And somehow, in that moment of pure desperate need, he had reached through the glass and taken that life for his own. The real Thomas Blackwood had been an orphan, shuffled from place to place, never belonging anywhere. His death had been noted but not mourned, filed away in bureaucratic indifference. It had been easy to slip into that empty space, to become the ghost of a boy who had never had a chance to really live. But he had left something behind in the asylum, the part of himself that couldn't escape, that was too damaged and broken to fit into the stolen life, the part that became the sleepless one, eternally patient, eternally waiting. "Now do you remember?" the sleepless one asked, and Thomas realized they were back in the cottage bedroom, though he couldn't say when the memory had ended and reality had begun. "I remember," Thomas whispered, "but I don't want to. Neither do I. But we cannot unmake what we have made. We are two halves of something that should never have been divided." The sleepless one was fading now, becoming translucent in the dim light of the bedroom. "They are coming for us, the doctors, the ones who know what we really are. Harold is one of them. He has been watching, waiting, reporting back." Thomas thought of Harold's nervous glances, his insistence that the asylum was empty, his fear when Thomas mentioned the bells. What do they want? To finish what they started, to complete the separation, to kill what remains of who we were and leave only the broken pieces. The figure was almost gone now, just a whisper of white in the darkness. "But we have a choice," the sleepless one said. "We can fight them. We can be whole again." "How?" "The mirror. In the real basement, not Harold's lie. It still shows the truth. It still remembers." And then he was gone, leaving Thomas alone in the bedroom with nothing but the echo of words and the lingering smell of disinfectant. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of what he'd learned. Was it real? Was any of it real? Or was this just another layer of madness, another delusion created by a mind that couldn't bear the truth of what it was? But the journal page was still there on the floor, covered in his handwriting, filled with words he didn't remember writing. And when he looked out the window, the asylum stood exactly as it had in his memory, whole and glowing with that strange inner light. The bells had stopped ringing. Thomas got up and went to the window, pressing his face against the glass. The asylum looked different now, darker somehow, as if the light had been extinguished from within. But in the central tower he could see movement, figures in white, moving back and forth behind the windows. They were coming. He had to find the real basement, the one the sleepless one had talked about. But first, he had to get past Harold. Thomas crept out of his room and down the hallway, pausing outside Harold's door. The older man was snoring softly, but even in sleep, he seemed restless, muttering words that Thomas couldn't quite make out. The cottage felt different as Thomas made his way through it, larger somehow, as if rooms had been added in the darkness. He counted doorways as he passed them, but the number kept changing, as if the house itself was shifting around him. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a door he'd never seen before, tucked away behind the kitchen. It was older than the others, made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when he touched the handle, it was warm, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. The door opened onto a staircase that descended much farther than it should have, given the size of the cottage. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, and the walls were covered in what looked like scratches, words and symbols carved into the stone by desperate hands. Thomas began to descend, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the way. The scratches on the walls became clearer as he went down, and he realized they were names. Hundreds of names, carved in different hands, different languages, different times. And there, near the bottom of the stairs, he found his own name. Not Thomas Blackwood, but something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat when he saw it. A name he had buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed, but that now rose to the surface like a body in water. Marcus Holloway. That was who he had been, who he still was, underneath the stolen identity. Marcus Holloway, patient at Fogmoor Asylum, diagnosed with severe dissociative disorder and a tendency toward violent episodes. Committed at age 16 after what? The memories were fuzzy, confused by drugs and time, but he could remember fragments, a house fire, screaming, the smell of smoke and burning flesh. His parents' faces twisted with fear as they looked at him, at what he'd become. He'd been sleepwalking, they said, had lit the fire without knowing it, without remembering. But Marcus knew better. He remembered the satisfaction he'd felt watching the flames consume everything, the way the heat had felt like an embrace. They'd called it an accident, but the doctors knew better. They'd seen the look in his eyes, the complete absence of remorse. That's what had gotten him committed, what had brought him to Fogmoor and the tender mercies of Dr. Aldrich. Marcus, reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with mirrors, dozens of them, each one reflecting something different. Some showed the cottage above, others the asylum. Still others places he didn't recognize, but that felt familiar in ways he couldn't explain. And in the center of the chamber stood the mirror he'd seen in Harold's basement, the same ornate frame, the same silvered glass. But here, it wasn't covered by any curtain. Here, it showed the truth. Marcus approached it slowly, his reflection wavering in the ancient glass. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't just his reflection he was seeing. There was someone else there, standing behind him, watching. He turned, but there was no one there. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, clearer now. It was the sleepless one, but not as he'd appeared in the bedroom. This was how he'd looked before the treatments, before the electrodes and the drugs had burned away so much of who he'd been. This was Marcus as he truly was, scarred and broken, but whole in his brokenness. "Are you ready?" the reflection asked. Marcus nodded. He was tired of running, tired of hiding behind a dead boy's name. Whatever came next, he would face it as himself. He reached out and touched the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled like water, and suddenly Marcus was falling through it, tumbling through layers of reflection and reality. He saw himself in the asylum, strapped to the bed while electricity coursed through his brain. He saw Harold, younger then, taking notes as the doctors worked. He saw the moment when part of him had broken away, had found the mirror and used it to escape into a borrowed life. And he saw Thomas Blackwood, the real Thomas Blackwood, dying alone in a hospital bed while his parents wept in the hallway outside. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. He had stolen that boy's life, had worn it like a costume while the real Thomas rotted in an unmarked grave. All these years he'd told himself he was the victim, that he'd been saved by some miracle or act of fate. But he was the monster. He always had been. The mirror deposited him back in the chamber, but it was different now. The walls were lined with hospital beds, and in each one lay a patient. Some were sleeping, others staring at the ceiling with vacant eyes. And in the bed closest to the mirror lay Marcus himself, older now, his hair gray and his face lined with years of medication and madness. "Welcome home," said a familiar voice. Marcus turned to see Dr. Aldrich standing in the doorway, flanked by orderlies in white coats. The doctor looked exactly as he had 15 years ago, as if time had stood still in this place. "We've been waiting for you to come back," Dr. Aldrich continued. "We always knew you would, eventually. The treatments only suppressed the dissociation, they didn't cure it, and Marcus Holloway was always too strong to stay buried forever." "I'm not Marcus anymore," Marcus said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. "I'm Thomas Blackwood." Dr. Aldrich smiled sadly. "Thomas Blackwood died 15 years ago, Marcus. You know that. You've always known that." The orderlies stepped forward, and Marcus could see the syringes in their hands, the restraints hanging from their belts. They were going to take him back to the White Room, back to the electrodes and the drugs and the endless sessions where they tried to convince him that his memories were real and his reality was false. But as they reached for him, the mirror behind Marcus began to glow. The surface rippled again, and suddenly the sleepless one was there, stepping through the glass like it was made of water. "No," he said, and his voice echoed through the chamber with the authority of absolute truth. "We are done with your treatments. We are done with your lies." Dr. Aldrich frowned. "This is just another dissociative episode, Marcus. Another fantasy to avoid facing reality." "Perhaps," the sleepless one agreed. "But whose reality? Yours, where broken minds can be fixed with enough electricity and chemicals, or ours, where the damaged and the lost find ways to survive that your textbooks never imagined?" The orderlies hesitated, confusion replacing certainty in their faces. Around the chamber, the patients in the beds began to stir, sitting up and looking around with eyes that were suddenly alert and aware. "We are all fragments," the sleepless one continued. "Pieces of people who were broken beyond repair, who found each other in the cracks between sanity and madness. You wanted to make us whole by destroying what made us unique, but we made ourselves whole by embracing what made us broken." Dr. Aldrich was backing toward the door now, his composure finally cracking. "This is impossible. You're just one patient, one damaged mind creating elaborate fantasies to avoid treatment." "Am I?" the sleepless one asked. "Then explain the others." He gestured to the patients, who were now standing beside their beds, and Marcus could see that each one was a reflection of himself, but different. Older, younger, scarred in different ways, wearing different faces. All of them fragments of the same shattered whole. All of them refugees from lives that had become unbearable. "We are the ones who fall through the cracks," the sleepless one said. "The ones who find ways to survive when survival should be impossible. You cannot cure us because we are not sick. We are evolved." Dr. Aldrich turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the corridor beyond. The orderlies followed, leaving Marcus alone with his other selves. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we choose," the sleepless one replied. "We can scatter again, return to our stolen lives and borrowed names, or we can be what we were always meant to be, which is something new. Something that doesn't fit in your categories or theirs. Something that exists in the spaces between reality and dream, between memory and madness." Marcus looked around at his other selves, at the faces that were his but not his, at the lives he might have lived if circumstances had been different. They were all waiting for his decision, but he realized that the choice wasn't really his to make. It belonged to all of them, collectively. "We vote," he said. One by one, his other selves nodded. They understood. They had always understood. And one by one, they stepped toward the mirror, their forms becoming translucent as they merged back into the reflection. Finally, only Marcus and the sleepless one remained. "Are you ready?" the sleepless one asked. Marcus looked back at the doorway through which Dr. Aldrich had fled, then at the mirror that had been both his salvation and his prison. "I was never born," he said, remembering the words from the journal. "I was remembered. And now?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time in years it was a smile without deception or pretense. It was the smile of someone who had finally stopped running from what they were. "Now I choose to be forgotten." He stepped into the mirror, and the sleepless one followed. The glass rippled one final time, then went dark. Above them, in Harold's cottage, the old man woke to silence. He checked Thomas's room and found it empty, the bed unslept in. On the pillow was a single sheet of paper, covered in handwriting he didn't recognize. The message was brief. "Thank you for watching over us. We are free now. The mirrors remember everything, but we choose to forget. Tell them we were never here. Tell them we never existed. It will be true enough." The boy who was never born. Harold crumpled the paper and threw it in the fireplace, watching it burn. Then he picked up the phone and dialed the number he'd memorized years ago. "Dr. Aldrich, it's Harold. He's gone. No, not escaped. Gone. Completely. Like he was never here at all." "Yes, I understand. I'll file the report in the morning." He hung up and walked to the window, looking up at the asylum on the hill. It was dark now, truly dark, as it had been for 15 years. The windows were broken again, the roof collapsed, the bell tower silent, but in the cellar, behind the curtain, the mirror still reflected something. Not the empty basement, but a place that existed between places where the broken and the lost found ways to be whole again. And sometimes, if you looked closely enough, you could see them there. All the fragments that had found each other, all the pieces that had chosen to become something new rather than allow themselves to be fixed. They were free now, free from names and histories and the terrible weight of being human in a world that had no place for them. They were remembered, and in being remembered, they were finally able to forget. Epilogue, the Watcher's Journal, found among the papers of Harold Whitmore, deceased, date of composition unknown. They think it's over. Dr. Aldrich filed his final report 3 months ago, marked the case as resolved through patient mortality. The official record shows that Marcus Holloway died of complications during treatment, a regrettable but not uncommon outcome for patients with his particular difficulties. But I know better. I've been watching the mirrors. It started small, just glimpses in peripheral vision, shadows that moved wrong, reflections that lingered a moment too long after you turned away. I told myself it was guilt, the weight of 15 years spent observing and reporting on a boy who had already suffered more than any human mind should bear. But then I found the journal, not the page Thomas left behind. I burned that as instructed. This was different, older, hidden behind the cellar mirror, written in a hand that predated Marcus Holloway by decades. The ink was faded, the paper yellow with age, but the words were clear enough. Patient manifests unprecedented ability to fragment consciousness across multiple temporal and spatial vectors. Standard therapeutic approaches prove ineffective. Subject appears to exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent, real and imagined. Recommend immediate termination of study. Dr. Cornelius Marsh, Chief of Psychiatry, Fogmoor Asylum, 1923. Dr. Marsh. I'd heard the name whispered in the halls of the asylum back when it was still operational. He'd been Aldrich's predecessor, a man who had supposedly died in the fire that closed the original facility. But here was his journal, describing a patient who sounded remarkably similar to Marcus Holloway. Except this patient had been treated 60 years before Marcus was even born. I kept reading, page after page of observations, all describing the same impossible phenomenon, a consciousness that refused to be contained within a single identity that scattered itself across time and space like seeds on the wind, taking root wherever it found suitable soil. Subject claims to remember lives he has never lived, places he has never been. Under hypnosis, he provides detailed accounts of events from the 1800s, speaking in dialects that died out decades ago. When confronted with the impossibility of these memories, he simply states, "I was never born. I was remembered." And the asylum staff reports similar disturbances to those observed in the Holloway case. Bells ringing in towers that have no bells. Patients found in rooms that were demolished years ago. Mirrors reflecting spaces that do not exist. Subject appears to exist simultaneously across multiple temporal states. I begin to suspect we are not dealing with a case of mental illness, but with something far more fundamental, a consciousness that exists outside the normal constraints of linear time and singular identity. The final entries were written in a shaking hand, the words barely legible. It's spreading. The other patients are beginning to exhibit similar symptoms. They speak of dreams where they are someone else, somewhere else, someone else. The boundaries between self and other are dissolving. I understand now why the subject claims to have been remembered rather than born. He is not a person in the traditional sense, but a pattern, a recurring motif in the symphony of human consciousness. He appears when minds are pushed beyond their breaking point, offering an escape route for those who can no longer bear the weight of singular existence. And the treatments don't cure him because there is nothing to cure. He is not sick. He is emergent. Pt.3, God help us all. The journal ended there, but I found more papers hidden throughout the cottage, documents that shouldn't exist, reports that contradicted official records, photographs that showed the same face across decades of asylum records. The pattern went back centuries. Always the same phenomenon, a consciousness that appeared in places of great suffering, gathering the fragments of broken minds and offering them a way to exist outside the boundaries of conventional reality. Sometimes he was called Marcus, sometimes Thomas, sometimes names I'd never heard, in languages I couldn't read, but always the same essential truth: he was never born. He was remembered, and now he was free. The mirrors told me the rest. Oh yes, they still work. Aldrich was a fool to think destroying the physical asylum would end anything. The mirrors remember everything, and in their silver depths I can see the truth of what we unleashed. He's out there now, scattered across the world like quantum particles, existing in the spaces between reality and dream. Every broken child who stares too long into a mirror, every lost soul who feels like they're living someone else's life, every fragment of consciousness that refuses to be contained, they're all part of him now. Or perhaps they always were. I see him sometimes, in shop windows and bathroom mirrors, in the black screen of my phone when it powers down, always watching, always waiting. Not malevolent exactly, but not benevolent either. He simply is, in the way that forces of nature simply are. The asylum is gone now. They finally tore it down last month, said the land would be developed into housing. But you can't tear down a place that exists primarily in memory and reflection. You can't develop land that was never entirely real to begin with. The construction workers reported problems almost immediately. Tools that moved when no one was looking, blueprints that rearranged themselves overnight, mirrors that reflected building that hadn't been built yet. 3 of them quit after claiming they could hear bells ringing underground. They'll abandon the project soon. They always do, and the land will remain empty, waiting for the next broken soul who needs a place to exist outside the boundaries of conventional reality. I've made my decision. The cancer is spreading. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. But I've learned from watching all those years, from reading the journals and studying the patterns. There's another way. Tonight, I'll go down to the cellar one final time. I'll pull away the curtain and look into the mirror that shows the truth behind truth. And when I see my reflection looking back at me, I won't turn away. I'll remember myself into something new, something that exists in the spaces between what was and what is, between memory and madness, between the broken and the whole. I was born Harold Whitmore, but perhaps I can be remembered as something else entirely. The mirrors are waiting. End of Harold Whitmore's final journal entry. Final fragment, The Echo. And found carved into the basement wall of 14 Holloway Street, London. Date unknown. And it came looking for me in the place I used to be, but I am no longer there. I am in the mirrors now, in the reflections and the remembrances, in the spaces between one breath and the next. I am every child who ever felt like they were living the wrong life, every soul who looked in the mirror and saw a stranger looking back. Every fragment of consciousness that refused to be contained within the narrow boundaries of singular existence. I was Thomas Blackwood, briefly. I was Marcus Holloway, longer. I was a dozen other names in a dozen other times, wearing faces like masks, borrowing lives like library books. Set names are just sounds, and faces are just flesh. What I am is older than either, deeper than both. I am the pattern that emerges when minds break in just the right way. The escape route that opens when reality becomes unbearable. the choice that exists for those who need to become something other than what they were born to be. The doctors thought they could cure me, fix me, make me whole. But I was already whole. I was whole in my brokenness, complete in my fragmentation. And now others have learned the secret. Others have found the mirrors, have looked through the glass, and seen the truth on the other side. They are remembering themselves into new forms, new existences, new ways of being human that transcend the limitations of linear time and singular identity. Then the asylum is gone, but the pattern remains. It will always remain. In every broken place, in every shattered mind, in every soul that needs to become something other than what it was. When we are the remembered, we are the never born. We are the spaces between what is and what could be. And we are free. Look for us in the mirrors. We are always there, waiting in the reflection, ready to remember you into something new, and ready to help you become what you were always meant to be. And a bell tower may be silent, but the bells still ring. Listen, remember, become.